Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the EO Cafe, where the EO community meet. We have it's been a little bit of a break between EO cafes for different reasons, but here we are back again with revisiting the subject of methane, which we discussed in March last year. Just a reminder to everyone, please, normal EO Cafe rules. Please keep your microphones muted unless I ask you to join the conversation. Um, please put any questions you have into the chat. You're very welcome to leave cameras on. We like to see people, but it's up to you if you leave your camera on. If you are asked to come in, please just introduce yourself as you enter and to prime your question. I just thought I'd give a little reminder for everybody that the EO Cafe is for you. We set it up for you. It was conceived at the time of the start of the COVID crisis as a way for people to meet virtually and keep in touch, even if we were confined to our houses and to our countries, I should say, and even to our houses. Different rules applying everywhere, but it's an opportunity for you to meet people involved in the EO community and to learn about different aspects of the community. So it's an information channel, and today is quite a good example of that because we set up a working group within ERSC for methane, to deal with methane. So a methane working group set up. And at their request, we have this EO Cafe, and hence there's a direct link. So it's nothing to do with promotional, really. It's about for you to get the opportunity to talk. Specifically for methane emissions, according to the IPCC, methane's global warming potential over 20 years is 82.5 times higher than carbon dioxide, and 30 times higher over 100 years. These figures are in the concept note. And methane is considered to be responsible for around a third of global warming since the industrial age began. So, given the high importance of curbing methane emissions, the recently adopted EU regulation on reduction of methane emissions on the energy sector and the key role that EO-based observations are playing in the monitoring of methane emissions are why we're revisiting this subject and why the working group was set up. So in the EO Cafe last year, I discussed with Megan Demeter from the Mars Program Manager at UNEP-IMEO, and Megan is with us again today. We had Cynthia Radnalls last time on the importance of the new IMEO initiative. This time, I'm pleased to say we've been joined by another colleague, Manuel Montesino, who is, I think, has a more technical role and will be able to sort of come in and help with questions that members may have around the technicalities of monitoring and the use of Earth observation. So without further ado, let me just start by asking Megan and Manuel Montesino to introduce themselves. Megan, please, just a little bit about yourself and why you're where you are and your background.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff. So thank you all as well for welcoming us back. It's always a pleasure to get to speak during the EO cafes, and excited to be here today with my colleague Manuel. So my name is Megan. As Jeff said, I'm the program manager of the Methane Alert and Response System at UNEP's International Methane Emissions Observatory. So EO is now in my day-to-day, but was certainly not necessarily in my background. I have a policy and economics background and came originally to the United Nations about 5.5 years ago now, largely focused on engaging governments, which is very important in particular in what we do through Mars, as we're trying to get this data into the hands of stakeholders in both governments and in companies. So in that way, a good fit. And now also working with Earth observation through Mars has been a really exciting opportunity to get to connect some of those more soft skills with this very technical nature of the EO work. And it's a real pleasure to get to speak to this community again.
Thanks, Megan. Manuel?
I'm remote sensing data analyst at Mars, the methane alert and response system of IMEO. And basically, I've been doing my whole career. I've been working with Earth observations. I've been doing research, postdocs on data analysis from different satellites, and I've been involved in a small satellite company in the development of the telescopes and algorithms for image processing. And now I'm happily part of IMEO on Mars and contributing through Earth observations to mitigate climate change, which is very important.
Okay, so thanks. So we already mentioned some key elements, but just as a reminder of some terms, Mars is the Methane Alert and Response System, which we'll hear more about. IMEO is the International Methane Emissions Observatory. And another term which will come up, OGMP, which is the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. And so having recalled that, perhaps now I could ask you, Methane, to talk about UNEP-IMEO and what is the Mars Initiative, and please give us a sort of some information regarding that, Megan. Thanks.
Absolutely, and you've noted a very true trend, which is that UNEP loves an acronym. So apologies to all colleagues.
Industry loves acronyms.
So Manuel and I both work for a project within the United Nations Environment Program called the International Methane Emissions Observatory, or IMEO. And IMEO was launched a little over 4 years ago now, coming out of this recognition that we need better data on methane emissions to be able to target action at the speed and scale necessary to meet the Paris Agreement, to meet the Global Methane Pledge, and really just to avert the worst impacts of climate change. So we also recognized that the vast majority of methane data that was being used was based on estimates using calculations, and that through a variety of science studies, we were starting to pull together a very robust body of evidence that emissions factors were really wrong. We have examples where emissions factors are underestimating emissions levels by orders of magnitude. We have other examples where emissions factors were completely misattributing where emissions were coming from. So if we followed them, we'd be going to the wrong sources of methane emissions. And so that was really the goal of IMEO, was to bring together all sorts of empirical sets of data and use them then to connect directly with the individuals who have agency to take action. So our mission through IMEO is to provide open, reliable, and actionable data specifically to those stakeholders who can use that data to take action. And so through IMEO, or under the management of IMEO, we run a number of sub-initiatives or projects, several of which you've mentioned. One is the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0. This is a industry reporting platform. It's the only one for the oil and gas industry that's based on direct measurements. We have over 140 member companies representing over 40% of global oil and gas production. And all of these companies have committed to actually measuring their emissions and then reporting them transparently through this partnership. We also fund a series of measurement studies around the world, and we're working with leading academic and research institutions to actually conduct those studies. And then finally, we have the Methane Alert and Response System, or MARS, which is the focus of our conversation here today. And through MARS, we're taking advantage of over a dozen satellites to bring together all of this data to identify major sources of methane emissions, specifically for now from the oil and gas sector, and then harness other data sets so that we can actually attribute that data to particular facilities and particular operators, and sometimes even particular sources. And then what's really unique from there about Mars is that we're using the engagement powers of the United Nations Environment Program as well, both through the UN as a whole, but also through our network of industry members in the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, to provide that information directly to stakeholders. So when we see emissions in a particular facility, we immediately send that data to the government, and if we can, to the operator. And the idea here is that this is really the information that they need to start to take action. And so once they have it, what we can also do is track that particular site to hopefully be able to document when mitigation takes place and have some really powerful images of, we had plumes, we sent a notification, and now we don't have plumes. And so that's really the goal through Mars and more broadly through all of our work at IMEO, is to catalyze and demonstrate methane emissions reductions.
Right. Okay. My next question was going to be around how the Mars Initiative works. I think we've pretty well covered that, but you've talked about government and oil industry stakeholders. Are there other stakeholders involved, or is it just those? No, I guess. Are there other stakeholders involved? How does it work?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the stakeholders that we notify, it's predominantly governments and operators, because those are the ones who really have the agency to do something. But in terms of who we work with, it's a much broader network. So as I mentioned, we're pulling information from over a dozen satellites. I'm sure we're all well aware of the many satellites that will be coming online or that have already launched, and we'll be working to integrate those as well. We have a number of technical partners, including UPV, ESRON, Kairos, with whom we work on satellite analysis. And then from the engagement side, there's also quite a large network that we're working with, including the IEA, the World Bank, the Climate and Clean Air Coalition, as well as both the EU and the US through the Global Methane Pledge.
Okay. So, and how does the satellite data feed into Mars? How's it integrated, and what real role does it play?
Absolutely. So I'll speak to this generally, and then we'll ask my colleague Manuel to build on from a technical perspective. But basically, we're taking a two-step approach where we're starting using some of the area mapping satellites to look for hotspots, regions where methane emissions are elevated. And then from there, we can point in with satellites with that more granular detection threshold to try to actually get down to the level where we can attribute it to a particular facility. We can only send those notifications when we've gotten to the point where we have an idea of where it's coming from. Yeah. So that's why we take that two-step approach. But I'd love for my colleague Manuel to build onto that as well.
We don't hear you. Oh, you're still mute. You're still muted?
No.
Oh, that's better.
Okay. So yeah, I'm just going to add some very few minor details, technical details about what Megan just mentioned, and is that basically what we do is we ingest the data from the different satellites into our system. Then the data goes through the processing pipeline that we have implemented, that is going through our servers. And then once the data has been analyzed, then there is an analyst that is looking at the results, looking that everything has gone through the pipeline correctly, that there are no artifacts, that the plume looks good, that there is no false positive. And once with that we have confirmed this, then all this information is saved, is stored, and then is when we continue with the process of notification that Megan was talking about to government and companies.
Okay. It's been suggested that firstly that you have a. Now let me come back to that direction. What about has it worked? I suppose is the question. Do you have concrete examples where Mars has been able to detect an emission, identify a source, notify the authorities, and see the emission reduced?
Absolutely. And apologies, my connection briefly cut out. Apologies if I missed a question. But on that particular point, yes, we have quite a few cases of this already. In our annual report last year, we highlighted two of these cases, one in Argentina that was specifically through Mars, where we did exactly what the system is supposed to do, and we notified our focal point in the government. They worked with the company who acted all of this information came back to us, and we were able to then go back and look with satellites and see that in fact the emissions had stopped. We had a similar example in Libya where this was able to happen. And I'll just note that a week from tomorrow, our annual report will be launching. And just to tease up a little bit, we have a number of further cases of this that will be included in the annual report. So very concrete demonstrations of mitigation. But what I'll also add is that these are fantastic demonstrations of how the system can work, but we need many, many, many more of them if we're going to really be achieving climate goals.
Yeah, I mean, how important were the reductions in terms of percentage of emissions, methane emissions?
Yeah. I will, without saying anything that's currently embargoed, many are important in terms of the magnitude of the events themselves, but of course 1, 2, 5, 10 even individual cases is not really touching that global methane concentration amount.
But I guess it's a question of showing it works and getting commitment to introduce fines or measures to suppress the emissions. I guess this is something that's got even more difficult in terms of climate change after the election in the US, where we know Trump's opposition to climate change, a denier of climate change. And I understand that I came across a case where a US group of oil companies, led by one called Hillcore, which is the leading, or designated as being the leading source or leading culprit for methane emissions in the US, is pushing it's pushing back on the fines that have been defined by the US government and imposed by the EPA. They are also a contributor to the Trump campaign. So this looks to be an area where there will be a big pushback in the implementation of emissions control. How do you perceive that now? Clearly, everyone's a bit wary of what will happen, but you're sort of very much in the fire line working with the EPA.
Absolutely. So what I can say is we send MARS notifications to all countries around the world every time we see them. We hope that we will be able to continue having a productive communication with the EPA regarding emissions that we see in the United States. Of course, there are a lot of emissions in the United States. What I'll add to that is that our ability to send these notifications directly to companies really hinges on if these companies are members of the OGMP, because we can't have a contact point in every single company in existence without having that relationship with them already through the OGMP. What we also see is that we get much more frequent and much more robust responses from our OGMP member companies. And then, of course, what that means is that we have that consistent communication that's not necessarily changing based on administrations. So just reinforcing really the importance of that membership and those relationships as well.
And cuts are voluntary. They are sort of taken on board from an ECG point of view.
Through OGMP?
Yes, or for the companies.
Yeah, so the OGMP is entirely voluntary. So all of these companies have chosen to join the OGMP. They set voluntary emissions reductions targets, but then the framework itself is standard for all companies. It's been designed by us in collaboration with partners like the European Union, et cetera, as well as member companies. And then UNEP is the one who is verifying whether or not companies have achieved what we call gold standard, which is laid out in the framework, but effectively means that they're measuring emissions at the vast majority of their assets.
Okay. Yeah, I said ECG, I meant ESG, of course. Um, there's a motivation for companies to respond. Maybe we can dig a little bit deeper into the technical side, as many of the people on the call are concerned with satellite data and the provision and analysis of satellite data. In terms of resolution, we're playing a trade-off between the spatial resolution and the sensitivity to detect an emission. How do you make that trade-off? Because clearly you're looking for small emissions, but at the same time, I imagine you need to be quite precise in identifying the location of the emission in order to say to whoever the culprit is, or maybe it's unknown, it's involuntary, that there is a problem here, and the proof that the responsibility lies with a certain organization. So how does that play out? No, you're on mute again, Manuel. That's better. Yeah.
No?
Yeah.
I think it's because of my computer that is filtering at the beginning what I'm saying, but okay.
Okay.
So basically where Mars starts is we are trying to take into account or consider all the satellites that are available to us in order to make these detections and quantifications of methane. And as you mentioned, there are different kinds of satellites with different trade-offs. They are generally classified into two different main groups, which are the area flux mappers and the point source imagers, basically. And each of them, they have their pros and cons. So as you mentioned, the area flux mappers, generally, they are good at providing an overview of a region or globally. They are more precise. They have, as you mentioned as well, a quarter spatial resolution. But they also offer more frequent revisits, and one of the main examples of an area flux mapper in Mars is PROPOMI, which is giving us plenty of information every day. Now with PROPOMI, there is this compromise. So we get data every day, but there is this compromise where there is this coarse resolution that you are not able to pinpoint where the source might be, but it's giving you a clue about where to look at. So we use in such case a TPQ approach where we once we have detected with PROPOMI, then we look with these point source images to see what we can get. Sometimes it is more or less clear from area flux mappers where the emissions might be coming from, but we always look for confirmation with point source images. And with point source images, basically they are a little bit less precise in terms of quantifying or detecting methane concentrations, but they have greater spatial resolution, and but also as well they provide less frequent revisits. So we have to combine here these two systems in order to get the most out of the pros and cons of each satellite.
Okay, there may be some members of the working group who want to dig into that a little bit further. I guess you also, for monitoring purposes, you install in situ sensors, in some cases at least, where it's practical. Is there a trade-off between the in situ sensors and satellite data? You don't need to acquire higher resolution data if there's an in situ sensor, presumably. Do you make that trade-off?
In general, for Mars, Mars is basically devoted to satellites. It's not so much about in situ sensors, and so we don't have to really care about this. But I guess that from a general perspective, it's always said in the community that these are complementary systems because each of them have their pros and cons, as with different kinds of satellites. Of course, they are next to the source, but at the same time, you just get an observation for limited point in space, while a satellite can provide you with the overview of covering a larger area.
Yeah. Okay. Pavel Pavlovsky in the chat is asking for more details on that. I don't know whether we've answered his question. Pavel, you want to come in further on that?
Well, not really. You just asked this question, but would be interesting just to understand a bit better. For example, a waste dump, right? Produced methane. Can you detect that? Or there's a leak from the tube. I was to a conference last year where it was a European Space Agency conference. There was a guy from, I don't remember, a gas company, not a British gas, but someone. He said from satellites doesn't work. You just can't detect that. So can you give a bit more technical details saying, no, it can be detected? To what extent? What typical source can be detected? What's the spatial resolution? This kind of things, if it makes sense. I think it does, no?
So here in Mars, sorry, maybe, yeah, my audio is working. Is it working? Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so basically at the moment in Mars, what we're working with is with oil and gas, leaks from oil and gas, which are very much concentrated plumes of methane. And of course, there is a limit to what satellites can do. And then is when you have to consider what's the resolution, what is the precision of the system. And not only you have to look at the observation tool that you're using, but you have to also consider how difficult the conditions are in terms of how is the landscape, how is the surface, the brightness surface that you're looking at, and what is the wind speed at the time that you are doing the observation. So all of these have an influence on how much methane can you detect. And usually for every pair of landscape or source plus instrument, they have what they call the minimum detection limit. That is the minimum amount of methane that you would be able to detect. So in case, for instance, for oil and gas, with using tropomi, for instance, our experience is that the minimum detection limit should be around 10,000 of kilograms an hour, while if we go for point source imagers, then we are around 1,000 kilograms an hour. Depends very much on what is the spectral resolution, what is the spatial resolution of the instrument, but again, those are the numbers that we are considering. So, for instance, when we want to look at one particular source, one of the first things that we do is we look at the area. We try to see how bright the area is, how complex the landscape is, and based on that first assessment, then we consider whether we want to use a simple instrument, something like a multispectral instrument that is good enough for detecting the emissions that we expect in that particular location, or whether we want to acquire images with a more sophisticated system that it can be a hyperspectral instrument like Prisma or ENMAP. And once we have decided what is the perfect blend between the two, then we start monitoring, and then we decide whether we made the right decision based on what we can see on our images, and then we change the mix if we think that is right. But regarding the other part of the question that you were asking whether that's possible or not, yes, it is possible, but it has a limit. So you cannot go beyond the minimum detection limit. Whether that it works or it doesn't, yes, it works. And there are some scientific publications that show through controlled methane releases that the satellite systems work well in detecting large emissions of methane.
Okay, thanks, Pavel. We'll come back to the technical side, but I said at the beginning that one of the stimulations for this was sort of a new regulation within the EU. Is Mars affected at all, impacted at all by the EU regulation? And how does that work with IMEO?
Yeah, so we work very closely with the EU. They're one of our founding members and a very close collaborator of ours. So we've had many discussions with them, and we're exploring ways that we can ensure that rapid response mechanism is aligned with Mars, and that we're building upon Mars for that. But at the end of the day, that is an EU regulation. Mars is not a regulatory vehicle, nor is there any enforcement through Mars in and of itself. When countries decide to implement that regulation, that certainly can support from a response aspect of Mars, because everything we do through the UN is voluntary. And we've created Mars as a service. We're providing this data as a free service to companies, to countries, but there's no mandate to respond. And so as countries like the EU or like the US are developing super emitter programs or rapid response mechanisms, this can help us increase engagement with Mars, but they are separate systems, and that enforcement side will be fully outside of Mars in and of itself.
But do you provide some form of cooperation? I won't say clearinghouse, sounds a bit too grand, but a means to look at the best practice in terms of implementation of legislation. Is that a role that you play, or we've lost?
Apologies, I'm back again.
Oh, you're here. Okay, we just lost your picture. Great, now you're fully back. No, I think we've lost your sound now.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're frozen. Now you're back. No, no sound. No sound. Okay, we can come back to that. I'll let you try and. No, we don't hear you, Megan, I'm afraid. Whilst you're trying to work it out, we can come back to that particular question later. Wolfhard has put a couple of questions now into the chat. I think the first one's more or less been covered. The second one, well, Wolfhard, has the first one been covered for you? Do you have anything to bring to the with your second question about the use of SAR? Wolfhard, hi.
Thank you, Jeff. It's more or less covered, but I would still like to ask if you have a coarse resolution sensor and you're looking at, let's say, a buried pipeline that is coming up through the surface at pumping stations and diversion stations, exchange stations, and there might be leaks either underground or at these stations. Are you using other satellites, other satellite data to locate the sources of these plumes as being, for instance, a pumping station? The reason why I'm asking this is I remember probably some 10 years ago, DLR and also MDA were doing interferometry on pipelines in Alaska to pre-detect leaks. At the time, we weren't able to really figure out whether there is a leak or not, but it was all about the vertical movement or 3D movement of the pipeline, resulting in cracks and then in leaks. That being said, even then, a couple of oil companies weren't really happy to release all the information about where exactly are their pipelines, where exactly are the pumping stations. If you do this in Russia, you might run into even further problems in locating the leak. So is this a possibility to add very high resolution optical sensors or SAR to perform exactly that job and really prove, okay, well, this leak is coming from that source because we could locate within our coarse methane sniffing image, we could locate with another high resolution sensor this as a potential source, and you please look at it. Could this be a scenario?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, I can now.
So yeah, so what I was mentioning before between the difference between RF flip mappers and point source images, between these in the second group, the point source images, we use high resolution data from satellites like Sentinel-2, Landsat. We use also ENMAP, EMADE, or Prisma in order to be able to detect methane leaks in more challenging conditions. And basically, what we do is once we have detected a plume of methane, we try to determine what is the potential source. And for that, we look at the wind speed, we look at the shape of the plume, and then we determine what is the most likely location of the source. And we always try to look as well at the equipment on ground by using different data sets on infrastructure, oil and gas infrastructure that exists and that exists out there, where you can more or less identify what is the infrastructure that you're looking at, and who belongs to, and what is the company that's running that particular infrastructure that is operating that infrastructure. And
But do you also look at the status of this infrastructure? Again, if you use INSAR technologies like DLR is using with TerraSAR tandem, we could detect very minute millimeters, a few millimeter accuracy, vertical or 3D movement of that infrastructure, or even two pipelines kind of breaking away if we have the right corner reflectors that we can use along those pipelines. And then we could really get to the cause and say, well, here is probably the leak because the status has been corrupted.
Yeah, I think that would be very interesting to add information to add in our system, because it provides more information which at the moment is pretty limited, even though we try to do our best to try to associate the emission with the source. Of course, if we have more confirmation, more evidence, you can build a stronger case against companies or governments. Yeah.
Thank you.
So how far does your role go towards investigation? You're providing the service, which is detecting that there are leaks and over time monitoring those. But to take that example with a pipeline, you're trying to identify whether there's been a movement, whether there's been a cracking, whether it's coming from an unrelated source. How far do you go in that? Is that part of your role?
So in terms of investigation, our role is somewhat limited. I think we're always interested in what other data we could integrate in, and this is a very interesting conversation. But of course, that final confirmation piece will usually or always necessitate some sort of action and investigation on the ground. And that really does lie with those stakeholders that we are notifying, and in particular with the operator. And so that's never the vision of IMEO or of Mars, that we will provide that investigative role, but that we provide the information that tells you what needs to be investigated to hopefully be able to target action better that way.
Yeah. And it's also, you're also providing the sort of evidence which would then link to, I mean, it depends either on the will of the member state or the country to implement the measures, which in a sense brings me back to the point I was trying to address earlier, whether you have a role in that implementation, whether there is a legislation system of proving, a system of fines, which is a national competence, but you're helping with evidence. Is that part of what you do?
So what we do is provide data to the government, and then the government can utilize that data however they like. For instance, coming back to our example of the United States, they of course have set up or are in the process of setting up the super emitter program, where that will be a component of it. And we're in discussions with them about how to share Mars data in that capacity. But our role starts and ends with sharing the data. We will not take any particular role in legislation or in enforcement, but if the governments choose to do that with the data, they're able to.
Yeah, enforcement, I guess it's clear. It's always a national national competence, but discussions related around the mechanisms for enforcement, the mechanisms for proof. Questions coming in. Enno Tiemann. Enno, do you want your interesting question about alignment of data?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep, hear you clear.
Okay, very good. Yeah, I had the question if like the data which will be provided by the OGMP companies, if you can also see that in satellite observations, or is it like on a whole different kind of scale?
So it depends. I mean, there's both from OGMP. To Manuel's point about these being complementary systems, I think that's really characterized well in OGMP, because with OGMP, we're trying to see everything and trying to get companies to understand all of their measurements and all of their emissions. And of course, through satellites, we're really just seeing those super emitter events. So we are working very closely with our colleagues who are managing OGMP to ensure that the data that we receive through the OGMP, we can utilize to better understand what we're seeing from satellites, and that with satellites, we're ensuring that super emissions are being captured in OGMP reporting. But we will get more granular information out of OGMP reporting than we'll be able to see with the satellites.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Enno. Niccolo Fabbro, you're talking about tasking.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so you presented just before the way you are detecting super emission, and then you have a focus to get more details regarding the resolution and identify the facilities. So my question is, are you able to task satellite from Mars for having more accurate localization of the and detection of the plume?
No.
Now, yes, yeah.
No point. Okay.
Curious effect. It's as you say, it's some sort of filter on your computer.
Yeah. I've tried to turn off these filters all the time, but I know. So to your question, Nicholas, yeah. So as Megan was mentioning before, we work together with satellite data providers to be able to test these satellites towards specific targets. That is in particular case for Prisma and EnMAP, where we define what is the target and then we request observations for that particular location. As any other user, we have a limited amount of data that we can request, and therefore that's why we do these compromises between different satellites depending on how challenging the location is. So we have a look at the place. We, as I was mentioning, we look at the heterogeneity, we look how dark the background is, and based on that, we make a decision whether we want to use multispectral instruments or whether we want to task a hyperspectral instrument. Yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. Regarding both the satellite capacity and other factors, what other research areas that you're particularly concerned about at the moment, or particularly looking to try and understand further, to either the interpretation of satellite imagery, the links to the emissions themselves? What are the priorities?
Well, at the moment, I think that one of the main priorities that we have is to always get better retrievals and more accurate quantifications of methane. And usually that means removing false positives, different ways to remove false positives. And in Mars, we have a system, we have different filters in order to remove these false positives at different stages. But at the end, we see that if we want to deliver quality data product, there has to be, at the moment, some manual intervention from some data analyst that has to look at plume, that has to confirm that exactly is the plume, and use different information to confirm that what we've detected is actually a plume. So that would be one of the main areas of research at the moment, developing these AI systems that can be able to detect methane and ignore potential false positives. There are some other areas as well, but that is the main one. Yeah.
Other areas which?
So, for instance, another thing that we're interested in is not so much related to the methane itself, but we are always looking at better wind speed data. So that is at the moment a limiting factor. We have wind speed information, very coarse wind speed information, and it's the main source of uncertainty in our quantifications. So we would like to access or to develop better wind speed data products that better represents what happens at local scales in order to get a better quantification and also help with the identification of true positives.
Okay. You're not currently using AI. You're testing.
Yeah. At the moment, the pipeline includes an AI, and this AI was published in a research paper, and I think that a second version is going to be published very soon. But still, of course, there are some limit cases where this AI doesn't work as planned, in person to false positives or false negatives, and there has to be someone taking care of that the results are nearly perfect.
Yeah. So I guess you see the question from Tony Sefton. I don't know, Tony, whether you want to develop that further.
Hi. Yeah. Hi, Jeff. Yeah, I see, Manuel, you started to answer that just as I was submitting it. So, I mean, if you could give maybe just some idea about the proportion of false positives, presumably when you report a potential emission, and then it's checked maybe by the operator, and perhaps they can't find a source. I mean, is there some other typical reason as to why that might have occurred? Is it some type of physical or biological process in the data? And also, can you say a little bit whether you get a higher number of false positives from particular satellite data? I mean, are there I'm aware that, for instance, Sentinel-2 is used quite a lot in the shortwave infrared for trying to monitor methane emissions. But of course, there are also satellites like GHGsat and other more tailored satellites for methane emissions. So, yeah, if you could just maybe give a bit more detail about how big an issue this is and whether one of the ways to get around it is by using data from other satellites or some other method in the processing. I know you were talking a bit about artificial intelligence there, but what are the ways to reduce the number of false positives? Can't hear.
Just wait a second and it will come at some point.
Yeah.
Okay.
We hear.
So answering you the questions, I don't have the number of the rate of false positives and true positives and so on the top of my head. I think it is published and you can look at the paper for the specific number. But regarding the false positives, I think it's an issue. It's an important issue. And the false positives depends, as I was saying, on the type of instrument and the landscape that you're looking at. So, for instance, if you look with Sentinel-2 at the third area in Algeria or in Turkmenistan, where the surface is very flat and very bright, then if you use the right algorithm, then you're safe in terms of false positives. But if you go to another area a little bit more complex with more crops, for instance, where the radiance is lower and the vegetation changes from time to time, then you can see that with Sentinel-2 you get quite a lot of false positives, and then you have to go to another kind of instrument like hyperspectral instrument like I was mentioning before, Prisma or ENMAP. And even if you work with those satellites, you as well get some false positives. So Mars, what it does, what we do is we always try to work with the state-of-the-art algorithms that provide the less amount of false positives possible for our retrieval. So, for instance, one example with hyperspectral instruments is the wide matte filter approach. So usually the matte filter approach uses the region in the third part of the spectrum around 2.4 microns. But there is another alternative algorithm that we've seen that is very robust, that is using not only the peak of absorption of methane at 2.3, 2.4, but also the peak of absorption at 1.6. So combining these two together, then you can get a better retrieval of methane and reduce the number of false positives. And the next step basically is just to train the AI with as much data as possible, which can help a lot to ignore all the false positives, capturing information also from the visual part of the spectrum. And then once you've done with the AI, then Mars, what it does at the moment is relying on a data analyst, and the data analyst uses different. It goes through a checklist of different aspects that he has to look at in order to be able to be confident that what he is looking at is a real plume. And one of the things that you were mentioning before is a very important thing, that is consider the full time series of images that you have for a particular area, where the artifacts may repeat from time to time, and then you can disentangle what is methane from what is not.
Okay, thank you.
And maybe just to reinforce something from that, when we're looking at false positives, I think it is useful in the context of Mars to differentiate between false positives and detections and false positives and notifications. And so Manuel is absolutely right that we have a robust process that we're going through to filter out those robust positives, so that when we send notifications, we have a very high confidence that it is a real methane emissions plume.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
From data acquisition to the final result, we have multiple filters along the way to remove all those false positives and get up to a very confident result. Yeah.
I guess it's not a particularly time-sensitive process, but what sort of time does the process take before you say, yeah, this is a strong emission, or you produce a report? Oh, and in that respect also, do you produce alerts or reports?
Manuel, I can speak to the second point if you want to start on the timing.
Okay. So regarding the timing, yes, you're right. So our system, the way it works is the system runs the pipeline overnight whenever there is new images available. And then we review all the alerts that we received in our system that we call the Plume Viewer. This is software that is showing all the alerts that we've received for all the locations that we're monitoring all over the world. We receive those alerts in this software, and then there is the data analyst that is going through the review of those alerts in order to confirm that what was shown was actually a plume. And this review of all the images that we get from different parts of the world, usually they have a weekly cycle where we try to review all countries on a weekly basis, and then we try to also look at all the plumes that had been detected during the previous week. Yeah, and once we've done that, then we can send a notification.
And so to the second question, there's sort of multiple things that we're producing, but in the nearest time frame, what we produce is a notification report. And this is what's sent to the stakeholders, either in the government or the operator. So this is including images of the plume, including the details on the time of the detection, the location, etc. And then in addition to that, after 30 days after that detection, the plume information also goes up into our data platform.
Okay. Okay. So sort of a hybrid, I guess. ERSC, we're mainly working with companies. I mean, companies are the members of the association, and I'm sure there are many areas they would be very interested to work with you to develop better systems or improve, whether it's better data, new satellites, or whether it's new processing systems. What opportunities, if any, or what channels, if any, do you see of working with companies?
Absolutely. So let me speak generally, and Manuel, please feel free to complement. And just to say, in terms of channels, one of our goals is to be integrating as much data into Mars, but also into IMEO's broader infrastructure as possible. And to the extent that there are companies that have other data that are interesting to potentially include, we're always happy to have those conversations and see how we can bring that into the ongoing analysis that we're doing.
Okay. So do you have particular ways in which you work with companies on horizon projects or on national projects? Is it a matter of getting national interest and then making the links, or how would that work? What should companies think of doing?
Perhaps, I mean, the relevant piece of information is that we can't pay for data.
Yeah.
And so the extent to which there are opportunities to work together in a different capacity, whether that's on a national level or with funding from some other source, we have examples of doing all of these types of arrangements, and would really I'm happy to have you share our email addresses, and would encourage anyone who's potentially interested or has a potential idea to reach out, and we're happy to discuss.
Okay, that's great, and I think through ERSC and the working group, they can certainly manage that. I'll draw things to a close there. We still have the opportunity to exchange further. We basically say, well, we'll turn off the recording. Anybody can come in with questions as they wish. I see Wolfhard had a last question there as well, so he may well want to pursue that. But thank you very much for your time again today. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope that there's a lot of stimulus for those on the call. We'll leave it through the working group to pursue, but I will close it at that point. Unless you have any last points you want to make?
Just to thank you again, Jeff, and the whole team for organizing this. It was a real pleasure, and looking forward to continuing these conversations.
Great. I think it's Tanya, Michelle, and Monica who've been mostly involved in the organization today. Thanks, and thanks for joining us, Manuel, and providing some of the sort of much more technical details. Want to just remind primarily the ERS members, well, really the ERS members, that there's an opportunity to help us brand Expand EO. So please, if you have ideas and proposals for branding, there's a link in the chat, and Tanya would be delighted to hear from you with ideas and propositions. On the screen, you see the next EOcafe in 2 weeks' time, standard time, 4 o'clock. EuroGeo, you may have heard of EuroGeo. We've talked with Geo in the past, and I think we'll soon have them back to talk again about how the group on Earth observations is evolving. But one thing that spun out of it is a number of regional geos, each of which has different characteristics and different even objectives. So EuroGeo had a meeting about 3 weeks ago, 2-3 weeks ago, and so what we want to do is to give you a bit of information about what's come out of that meeting, what the opportunities are for getting involved in EuroGeo, and what it will hope to provide and achieve. So that will be the EOcafe in 2 weeks' time. So at that point, we'll turn off the microphone, the recording even, not the microphone, but the recording, and feel free, anybody, to just join in.